city breaks over the years have become one of the most popular forms of holidaying due to the fact that they present the perfect blend of culture, excitement, history, shopping and relaxation. However, most cities around the world will heavily favour one element over another, and it's often difficult to find a city that truly has a little of everything on offer, until that is, you set foot in Dublin, the capital of Ireland. This remarkable, compact city has everything the intrepid urban explorer could possibly desire, and probably a great deal more besides. At first glance today, Dublin is a lively, cosmopolitan city, with a welcoming atmosphere and wonderful hospitality. But this wasn't always the case, and down through the ages, bitter battles and bloody wars have been fought on Dublin streets, and you don't have to look too far to find evidence of the carnage. Founded on the banks of the River Liffey, Dublin first began to really take shape from when Viking invaders started a settlement here in the 9th century. As time moved on, further invasions, most notably by Ireland's near neighbours on mainland Britain, signalled further conflict, eventually resulting in the Anglo-Norman seizing control of Dublin. Matters were made considerably worse during the reign of Henry VIII, when England broke away from the Catholic Church in favour of the Protestant movement, and religion became a major issue in the conflict between the English forces in occupation and the native Irish. The battle for Irish independence continued well into the 20th century, with Dublin always at the heart of any dispute. But far from lying in ruins, the city has grown strong from its trials and tribulations, rising phoenix-like from the ashes on so many occasions. Consequently, deciding where to start any tour of Dublin can be a difficult choice. But as the story of this great city will unfold as we travel around, there's probably no better place to begin than at the National Museum. It was originally built in the 1880s to the design of Sir Thomas Deane, and this wonderful, classically designed Victorian building is a joy to visit both inside and out. Within these walls, visitors are able to follow the story of Dublin from its Viking beginnings right through to the present day, and the surroundings are spectacular. The most impressive feature has to be the wonderful domed rotunda that sits on top of the museum like a fine crown. In fact, the design of this part of the building was actually borrowed from the Altes Museum in Berlin, created some 50 years earlier, but is far from being just a replica, as this museum is one of the finest examples of Victorian architecture you'll find anywhere. In fact, it would be perfectly feasible to spend this entire programme viewing both the architecture and contents of this truly fascinating museum, but there's a great deal more to see, and you only have to step outside to reach our next destination. One glance at Ireland's National Library will tell you that it's also the work of Sir Thomas Deane, looking very similar to the National Museum, and you could quite easily get them confused with their matching pillared fronts and a wonderful domed rotunda. Of course, as soon as you step inside this building, with its thousands of books and scriptures, you'll know immediately that you're in a library rather than a museum. Nevertheless, despite its proximity to the National Museum, the National Library is often missed by many tourists, which is a great pity. After all, Dublin has such a strong connection with legendary authors such as Oscar Wilde, James Joyce, Yeats, and Bram Stoker, which in itself makes this a fascinating place to visit. All of these authors have been linked with the National Library over the years, so spending time here is a great way to follow in their footsteps. Visitors' passes are available for the Great Reading Room, where a copy of every book to be published in Ireland can be found, along with old maps and significant manuscripts. And just like the museum, you could spend many a happy hour here uncovering the past. But it's time to continue our journey of discovery and take a few steps south to find the building that flanks both the museum and the library. This imposing Georgian structure is Leinster House, and although originally built as a great town mansion for the Duke of Leinster since 1922, it has had a far more important role to play in Dublin's story. This mansion is where the two chambers of the Irish Parliament sit. Interestingly, just as Leinster House has two chambers of Parliament, the building also has two very different facades. The main entrance that you'll see from Kildare Street was built to look like a town mansion, and with its grand windows and classic Georgian design, it's picture perfect, providing a wonderful setting for the Houses of Parliament. However, if you take a wander around to the rear of the building, looking out onto Merrion Square, this entrance, although equally elegant, was built to emulate a great stately home. Without the tall pillars, this entrance really does look like it should be situated on some huge country estate, and the gardens are absolutely lovely, with many species of trees, making this one of the loveliest government buildings anywhere in the world. This idyllic setting is undoubtedly helped further by the glorious Merrion Square, which is considered to be the finest of the many Georgian squares to be found in Dublin. The whole square covers a very impressive 12 acres, and every part of it has been expertly cultivated. It really is one of the most beautiful spots in Dublin, just to sit a while and unwind, which is exactly what one of Merrion Square's most famous residents is doing here now. Reclining on a rock and looking thoroughly decadent is the great literary genius Oscar Wilde, who actually lived in this square as a child from 1855 to 76. Indeed, over the years, many of Dublin's greats have resided in this beautiful square, including the poet W.B. Yeats at number 82 and the Irish freedom fighter Daniel O'Connell at 58 Merrion Square. However, this wasn't always such an affluent place to live, and as well as housing Dublin's rich and famous, it also has a strong link with the city and the Irish nation's more turbulent past. In the 1840s, the attractive flower beds were left to grow wild as Merrion Square served as an emergency soup kitchen to feed the many starving people during the Great Potato Famine that drove so many into the towns and cities from the countryside. Despite Merrion Square having long since been restored to all its former glory, Dublin's turbulent past has never been forgotten. Native Dubliners are a proud people who've had to come to terms with the hardship and injustice that history has dealt them. And one of the most prominent sites in the city that typifies what the people of Ireland endured on their path to freedom is the General Post Office. Originally built in 1818 on what is now called O'Connell Street, this building, with its Greek-style facade and impressive columns, looks like any other fine city building. But take a closer look at the fabric of the stonework, and you'll quickly discover that there's more to the history of this post office than simply the collection and distribution of the mail. The elegant pillars are riddled with dents and holes, which in any other city could be attributed to wear and tear. But in Dublin, the scars of history have been left on many buildings. During the Irish Uprising of 1916, when Irish protesters tried to proclaim independence once again for their nation, the post office was seized as the freedom fighters barricaded themselves inside. British Army of Occupation retaliated, bombarding the building with gunfire, the cause of the damage to the pillars that you can still see to this day. But it was some days before the rebels gave up the post office and surrendered. The Easter Rising was unsuccessful and cost many their lives, with over 300 citizens killed by the British, while 14 of the Irish leaders were swiftly executed. Nevertheless, history has viewed this as a turning point in the Irish struggle for independence, and the bullet holes that can still be seen in the pillars of the General Post Office remain as a testament to the bravery of those who paid the highest price for their cause. While we're on the subject of national heroes, a short walk along the appropriately named O'Connell Street will bring you to the impressive statue of the man himself, Daniel O'Connell. Often referred to as the Liberator, O'Connell was one of Ireland's first really successful freedom fighters, many years before the Easter Uprising. O'Connell used mass peaceful protests to restore the civil liberties of Ireland's Catholic population, before going on to become the first Catholic mayor of Dublin in 1841. The work of Daniel O'Connell paved the way for future generations to chip away at the stranglehold that the Protestant faith and British rule held over the Irish. The contribution that Daniel O'Connell made to Ireland's history is remembered in this wonderful monument, which was created by the artist John Foley. As O'Connell stands tall on top of his monument, overlooking the street that bears his name, people rush about their business in the fall of his shadow. Ironically, the struggle to get the monument completed, although nowhere near as long as the fight for independence, took almost 20 years. But the wait certainly seems to have been worthwhile, and O'Connell's name is one that you'll hear wherever in Dublin you happen to go. A perfect example is this wonderful stone bridge that effortlessly spans the River Liffey, also named in O'Connell's honour, although it definitely predates him, having been opened in 1794. This bridge may not be the most picturesque in Dublin, but it nevertheless proves just how respected O'Connell was. Other statues to look out for on O'Connell Street include the legendary Irish political leader Charles Stewart Parnell. Just into Earl Street North, you'll find the writer James Joyce. The statue of Joyce by Marjorie Fitzgibbon was completed in 1990 as a tribute to this most famous of Dubliners. although just like Parnell, he was as controversial as he was popular. Today, some would still argue that the novels of James Joyce are an acquired taste, but that Dublin has embraced the art of this truly unique author is now beyond question. And while we're on the subject of controversy, the Monument of Light outside the General Post Office certainly aroused negative public opinion when it was erected in 2003. But Dubliners and visitors alike seem to have got used to the spire that stands where Lord Nelson's statue once dominated the scene before being blown up by the IRA in 1966, and for the time being at least, is set to stay as part of Dublin's skyline. However, in this lovely corner of Dublin, you're far more likely to meet with fine Georgian architecture than modern art, and the forecourts prove the point beautifully. Sitting slightly upstream from O'Connell Bridge, the forecourts are a glorious example of early Georgian architecture. Again, like many other buildings in the city, beneath the classic copper-covered dome lies a turbulent history. During the 1920s, civil war raged in Ireland, and when anti-treaty rebels occupied the forecourts, government forces didn't hesitate to sacrifice the beautiful building in order to put down the rebellion. There was little left intact, and it took until 1932 for the forecourts to be restored to their former glory. But as you can see, the effort was definitely worthwhile, with the original 18th century designs of architect James Gandon faithfully adhered to. Today, Ireland's modern judiciary system occupies this wonderful building, where tourists can mingle in the waiting hall amongst the solicitors and barristers busily going about their affairs. Nevertheless, there was one national treasure that couldn't be replaced. The Public Records Office, adjacent to the forecourts, was also destroyed in the Civil War, and all the documents were lost in the fire, so consequently, anyone trying to trace their Irish ancestors will have a very difficult job indeed. Although Dublin's history can at times seem rather bleak, it really is a testament to the spirit of survival that has characterised the city. Another building that shares this remarkable heritage is Trinity College, which can be found to the south of O'Connell Bridge. Founded in 1592, Trinity College is a huge complex that was built on the site of an Augustinian monastery, was founded to address what Queen Elizabeth I of England called the barbarism of the Irish. The entrance is as grand as you would expect from such a prestigious college, and when you stand before this great seat of learning, you can't help feeling as though you're in the shadow of greatness. Many of Ireland's most famous writers and thinkers were educated here, and have walked through the entrance gates into Parliament Square. There's a wonderful atmosphere all around, And for the graduates, amongst them the playwrights Oliver Goldsmith and Samuel Beckett, a Trinity education was indeed a precious thing. Today, Trinity is still much revered, with students from all over the world coming to study at this historic college. However, it's only really been since the 1970s that Trinity College has been such a cosmopolitan university. Prior to this, for almost 400 years, the college was only accessible to Protestants. And although Trinity officially accepted Catholics from 1793 onwards, it wasn't until the 1970s that the Vatican allowed them to study here without the threat of excommunication. Standing in these beautiful grounds in the shadow of so many wonderful buildings, it's hard to believe that such segregation once existed here. In fact, when you take even a short break in Dublin, it's hard to imagine that conflict shaped so much of this now lovely city. The green expanses of Trinity College are the perfect place in which to soak up the refined atmosphere of this part of Dublin, and you only have to look across the road to see another fine example of grand architecture. Today, this glorious Georgian building is the Bank of Ireland, and you may well be thinking that this building is rather too grand for a bank, considering most banks around the world are rather dull and grey affairs. What's more, you'd be perfectly correct in your assessment, because this was actually Europe's first purpose-built Parliament House. Henry Grattan, another of Ireland's great libertarian politicians, formed Grattan's Parliament, and in 1729 began work on his Houses of Parliament. However, the Irish Parliament was short-lived, as the British government in London passed the Act of Union in 1801, clawing back authority in Ireland. With the Parliament building becoming surplus to requirements, it was sold to the Bank of Ireland, an institution that has wisely hung on to this magnificent asset. Nonetheless, Grattan is remembered for his efforts, courtesy of a statue. However, it's within the structure itself that Grattan's vision really lives on. With a fine Greek-style facade and elegant columns, the Bank of Ireland is worthy of any visitor's attention, beyond the withdrawal of cash and the exchange of currency. The one thing you'll quickly learn as we travel around Dublin is the fact that this is a city of contrasts. Continuing along from the hallowed entrance to Trinity College, within seconds the atmosphere completely changes as we enter the charming and thankfully pedestrianised Grafton Street. Although quiet today, at the height of the summer season you'll find all manner of street entertainers here, ranging from the more run-of-the-mill buskers and street artists right through to the unique Irish street poets. But what really draws the entertainers here is the crowds, because Grafton Street is the heart of Dublin shopping centre. There are some of the biggest fashion names here, and many wonderful department stores, all housed sympathetically in the delightfully traditional buildings. It's well worth wandering off down the side alleys that lead from Grafton Street, especially if you're looking for smaller, unique shops that are not major high street chains. But Grafton Street isn't just about the street entertainers and shopping. There's one particular attraction that many visitors come especially to see.
In Dublin's first city, where the girls are so pretty, I first laid my eyes on sweet Molly Malone. As she wheeled her wheelbarrow through the streets broad and narrow, crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh.
By now you could be forgiven for thinking that all of Dublin's history is either deeply tragic or politically motivated. But there's one character from Dublin's past who is far more frivolous, and her statue can be found on Grafton Street, where a crowd of sightseers will normally be gathered.
And sure it was no wonder, for so were her mother and father before, and they both wheeled.
We are, of course, talking about sweet Molly Malone, the prettiest girl of Dublin's fair city, made famous in the traditional song. Now, the unofficial anthem of Dublin, it's often sung by supporters of Ireland's national rugby team, with Molly being based, if local legend is to be believed, on a 17th century street trader who sold cockles and mussels from her wheelbarrow. There's speculation that Molly had quite a different profession by night, but whatever the truth of the matter, her statue, fondly referred to as the trollop with the scallops or the tart with the cart, is one of Dublin's most popular landmarks.
Could save her, and that was the end of poor Molly Malone. Now her ghost.
Now, after experiencing the delights of Grafton Street, if you suddenly find yourself in need of some light refreshment, you need look no further than Bewley's Oriental Cafe, which is something of a surprise, to say the least, in the middle of Dublin. In fact, even if you aren't flagging, this is the social hub of Grafton Street, and as the cafe has been serving fine teas and coffees since 1927, you might as well partake of what's on offer. But should you still be feeling a little jaded, what could be nicer after a pleasant tea break than a walk in the park? Dublin may be a fairly compact capital, yet it still has plenty of open spaces for the intrepid city explorer to enjoy, and St. Stephen's Green is arguably the finest of them all. When Dublin was in its infancy, this was simply marshland that was used for grazing. However, since 1663, the space has been cultivated, and today it's one of Dublin's best loved attractions. Probably the most impressive way to enter St. Stephen's Green is through the Fusiliers Arch, which can be found at the end of Grafton Street. Built in 1907, this beautifully understated memorial arch was erected to honour the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, who fought in the Second Boer War from 1899 to 1902. Once within the peaceful confines of St. Stephen's Green, many people head for the delightful ornamental lakes and water features, which are a favourite lunching spot for hungry students, city workers and exhausted shoppers alike. However, the varied midday crowd usually have to share their sandwiches with the many ducks and waterfowl that also congregate here, on the lookout for any falling crumbs. There's something here at St. Stephen's Green to please everyone, because this is one inner city space that really does get used by native Dubliners, as well as the many tourists that come to visit. In fact, St. Stephen's Green is a wonderful example of Dublin's ability to accommodate the requirements of 21st century life, without endangering the city's heritage and treasures of the past. St. Stephen's Green is one of the most popular areas in Dublin, and the district that surrounds the park is equally as fascinating as the delightful gardens. Take a stroll along the streets that run around the outside of the park, and you'll discover even more about Dublin's living history. Every building has a tale to tell, with the most impressive being the elegant Royal College of Surgeons. Opened in 1810, students from all over the world still come to study here today. And if you look up to the top of the building, you'll immediately see that they're in very good company. The fine statues represent the ancient Greeks, Asclepius, who was the god of medicine, Hygeia, to his left, the goddess of health, and to his right, Athena, the goddess of wisdom. However, it's very appropriate that Athena was also the Greek goddess of war, because the Royal College of Surgeons played a major role in the Easter Uprising of 1916. There were many protesters locked in battle with British soldiers, and when they were forced out of St. Stephen's Green, they sought refuge in the Royal College of Surgeons building. Just like the General Post Office on O'Connell Street, which we saw a little earlier, the facade of this fine building still carries the scars left from that fateful time, with a mass of bullet holes reminding all who come here of Dublin's turbulent past. By contrast, the district around St. Stephen's Green couldn't be more peaceful for today's visitors, and perhaps not surprisingly, this area now boasts some of Dublin's favourite hotels. One of the loveliest is situated on St. Stephen's Green North, the unmistakable Shelbourne Hotel. Built in 1867, although only recently refurbished, anyone who stands in front of the Shelbourne can tell right away that this is a very classy establishment, and many of the rich and famous stay here when they come to Dublin. But have no fear. If your wallet can't quite stretch to a night stay in one of the hotel's delightful 190 rooms, then afternoon tea in the Lord Mayor's Lounge is a perfect compromise, and is almost as traditional as a pint of Guinness in a traditional Irish pub. As you'll have realised by now, religion has been at the heart of much of Dublin's historic turmoil down through the ages, and is an integral part of their history. So naturally, when you visit Dublin, there are some very fine churches and cathedrals worthy of your attention. The first on our list is actually a cathedral that is in fact Ireland's largest church. St. Patrick's Cathedral has been standing on this spot since the 13th century. However, there's been a place of worship here since about 450 AD, when St. Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland, was said to have baptised converts in a sacred well on the site. Originally, the church was a simple wooden construction. However, what you'll see here today is an altogether much grander affair. Nevertheless, you may be surprised to discover that despite the cathedral's size and importance in the 1800s, much of this wonderful building had fallen into a terrible state of disrepair, and drastic action was required to save it. Fortunately for all concerned, by the mid-1800s, the new dean of the cathedral, with the added advantage of securing financial support from the Guinness dynasty, who were already producing their characteristic black beer along the banks of the River Liffey, worked tirelessly to save the building from destruction. It was definitely a worthwhile exercise, as St. Patrick's is one of Dublin's most popular tourist attractions for 21st century visitors, as well as being a magnificent place of worship. One of the most popular sites here is the tomb of the Dublin-born political commentator and author Jonathan Swift. famous creator of Gulliver's Travels, who also happened to become the Dean of St. Patrick's in 1713. Always an interesting character, people are also intrigued by his relationship with a much younger woman, Esther Johnson, better known to the world as his beloved Stella, and she too is buried here, not far from Swift. Ironically, St. Patrick's was not the only church in Dublin to fall into a shambolic state, and our next destination also needed rescuing. This wonderfully ornate church, not all that far from St. Patrick's, is Christ Church Cathedral, and it's appalling to think that such a fine structure was also allowed to fall into wreck and ruin during the 19th century. Christ Church has sat on this spot since 1172, when Strongbow, the Anglo-Norman conqueror of Dublin, commissioned it to be built. However, just like St. Patrick's, the original building was a far cry from the fine structure that now stands in its place. The architect in charge of the restoration added some remarkable features, including the wonderful flying buttresses, which have been positioned to strengthen the more intricate architecture. They may not be as large as the flying buttresses that can be found at the more famous Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. However, they're still very impressive and add a real sense of splendour to this great church. Another feature to look out for that the architect George Street added is this beautiful arched bridge that joins the main building to the Synod Hall. Inside the church, the Strongbow monument, medieval lectern, and the casket containing the heart of St. Lawrence O'Toole are major points of interest, and again it is a place of worship, with services twice daily, Monday to Friday, and of course on a Sunday. To call our next location simply another historic site would be doing it a great injustice, as the Dublinia exhibition covers in great depth the history of Dublin from the arrival of Strongbow in 1170 to the beginning of Henry VIII's rule in 1541. Fortunately, there's no arduous journey required to get here, as it's housed in the aforementioned Synod Hall, which indeed looks like a small church in its own right. And before it housed the Dublinia exhibition, it was the home of the ruling body of the Church of Ireland. For a short while between the two functions, the hall had a brief sojourn as a nightclub, but the Dublinia exhibition has proved to be well suited to its more ecclesiastical surroundings. For anyone who has the time to explore Dublinia more fully, there are some fascinating exhibits, and the climb to the top of St Michael's Tower is well worth the effort. This marvellous 60-foot high edifice offers some fantastic views across Dublin, and because the building's already perched on the top of Dublin Hill, the views from here are delightful. Like so many of the world's greatest cities, Dublin has been built on a major river that gives it access to the sea via the Port of Dublin. Some of this city's most picturesque views can be found along the River Liffey, and many of Dublin's most important buildings are also situated here. The old Custom House surely has to be one of the most impressive buildings to overlook the Liffey, and it really does dominate every riverside view in this area. The Custom House can be found just east of O'Connell Bridge on the north side of the river, where it's held pride of place since 1793. However, this certainly wasn't the best of timing, because complete with its domed tower and arched windows, this was designed to be Ireland's custom house, dealing with all the issues regarding imports and exports for the independent government of the nation. But this autonomy from Britain was short-lived, because a mere 8 years after the building's completion, the 1801 Act of Union was passed, as the government in London took control. Without a purpose, the Custom House was left to decay, and perhaps even more shockingly, it wasn't until 1991 that the building was finally restored to its former glory and put to good use as fully functional government offices. It would have been a huge loss for Dublin if this building had been allowed to totally crumble, for as anyone can see, it really is one of the city's most magnificent buildings. Despite visitors not being allowed into the Custom House any longer, it's still well worth making the time to come and see it, although some of the best views are to be had from the opposite bank of the River Liffey. On the facade of the Custom House, be sure to look out for the 14 exquisite allegorical heads by the famous Dublin sculptor Edward Smith, which form the keynotes for each of the arches and entrances to the building. Smith ensured that each was totally unique, representing Ireland's main rivers and the Atlantic Ocean. Again, the original architect of the building was James Gandon, the man responsible for the forecourts that we saw a little earlier. And although not as large as that dome, this one is equally fascinating, topped with a fine statue representing commerce. There are many beautiful buildings and fabulous architectural features along the River Liffey, and ancient and modern really do sit very comfortably side by side. The past has without doubt made the people of Dublin strong, and while walking along the Custom House Quay, you can't miss the haunting monument to the many people who lost their lives in the Great Irish Famine of 1845 to 48.
My young love said to
Dubliners have a great deal of respect for their history, and Rowan Gillespie's evocative statue proves the point beyond question. These gaunt figures appear to be slowly creeping towards the Dublin quayside in search of the ships that would take so many Irish nationals away from their homeland, hoping to find a better life across the Atlantic Ocean in America. Even so, many perished before even reaching the USA, and it's believed that in excess of 2 million people died as a result of the famine.
It will not be long.
Today, you'll find a thriving Irish community in many American cities, especially New York, where the Irish landed to be greeted by the Statue of Liberty all those years ago. And this is one place where St. Patrick's Day is celebrated with as much passion as in the Emerald Isle itself. As you'll have realised by now, even the most beautiful of Dublin's buildings have a dramatic and turbulent history. And wherever you go in the world, a castle will nearly always have terrible tales to tell. And never a truer word was spoken about Dublin Castle, the symbol of tyranny and occupation by the British for some 700 years. It's perhaps fortunate that after achieving their independence, the new generation of Ireland's leaders allowed the castle to stay standing. In fact, the castle has been very well cared for indeed, and future generations are able to learn firsthand of Ireland's past. This may seem to be a rather confusing amalgamation of buildings, as the castle has been constantly refurbished and updated since the 13th century, when the first castle was built here. But apart from the record tower, little of the original structure remains. Over the years of British domination, the fortress was strengthened with extensions and towers, the most impressive including the Birmingham Tower on the far western side, and the ornate Bedford Tower that overlooks the upper yard. Eventually, after centuries of dispute, on January the 16th, 1922, the castle was formally handed over to Michael Collins, the legendary freedom fighter and president of the new Provisional Irish Government. Legend has it that the last British Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Viscount Fitzalan, complained, "You're 7 minutes late, Mr. Collins," to which Collins replied, "We've been waiting 700 years. You can have the 7 minutes." Sadly, it was a short-lived moment of triumph for Collins, who was assassinated before the year was out, while his fellow freedom fighter, Eamon de Valera, went on to lead Ireland into the modern age. Another nearby building with a tale to tell, dating back to the conflicts of the early 20th century, is Dublin City Hall. This fine-looking architectural treasure, with its domed roof and massive pillars, was constructed between 1769 and 1779, and the sheer height of the building illustrates just how important the City Hall was. And it's here that the Royal Exchange was based. Now, despite the Irish objecting to being controlled by the British, the extremely skilled workmanship of the City Hall shows how affluent Dublin was under British rule in the 18th century. Step back in time and imagine the businessmen and merchants of the 1700s climbing the steps before completing their transactions, ensuring the city's continued prosperity. The history of City Hall isn't just about commerce though, as it too played its part in Ireland's fight for freedom, because during the Easter Uprising it afforded rebels a perfect vantage point. During the uprising, snipers climbed to the top of the dome, where they fired on the British soldiers below, until they were captured when the uprising failed. However, not all of the great classical buildings of Dublin are famous for trouble and strife. And when you arrive at the great doors of the Powerscourt townhouse, you might struggle to guess what makes this elegant place so special. Step inside, and you'll see that this great 18th century mansion has now been turned into a shopper's delight, a wonderful array of merchandise on offer, along with some delightful cafes and restaurants displaying a style quite literally all their own. This grand-looking townhouse with sweeping stairway and classic Georgian facade is one of Dublin's most popular tourist attractions today, and is proof positive that this truly is a city of very pleasant surprises. Nevertheless, this isn't the only location where you'll find the perfect mix of shopping and history in Dublin, because just a short distance away lies the district known as Temple Bar, where the true character of this city is on display 24 hours a day. If upon first glance you get the impression that this lively area couldn't be less temple-like, you'd be quite correct, because it got its name from Sir William Temple, who acquired the land in the early 17th century. The cobbled streets stretch from Dame Street down to the River Liffey, and back in the 1600s, a bar simply meant a riverside path, hence Temple Bar. Over time, the district became home to many small businesses, and most affluent during the 19th century. However, in the 20th century, the district did fall into something of a decline, and by the 1960s had been bought up with a view to the building of a bus station. Until work could begin, artists and small independent retailers were granted short-term leases. But when the plans for the bus station were scrapped, they stayed on, and the rest, as you can see for yourself, is history. In Temple Bar today, you'll find bars, restaurants, shops, galleries, and a delightful array of buskers and street entertainers. And there's always something different to enjoy around Meeting House Square. In this part of the city, the troubles of the past are left behind, as Dubliners and visitors alike experience the pleasures of the present and hopefully the future. For anyone planning an outing to Temple Bar, the nicest way to arrive has to be on foot. And if you're on the far side of the Liffey, there's a pedestrian bridge that is quite literally the pride of Dublin. The Halfpenny Bridge links Temple Bar on the south side with Liffey Street on the north, and is a high arched footbridge made of cast iron, used by thousands of people every day. It's also definitely one of Dublin's most photographed attractions, and was built by English ironworker John Windsor and opened in 1816 as the Wellington Bridge. The Duke of Wellington, one of Britain's greatest military leaders, was born in Dublin, but was very disparaging about his country of birth, and when mistakenly described as Irish, he claimed that being born in a stable didn't make one a horse. Perhaps not surprisingly, Wellington was far from being a great favourite in Dublin, so people ignored the bridge's title, preferring to call it the Halfpenny Bridge because of the toll that was charged to cross. Even when the toll was abolished in 1919, the name stuck, and it's very likely that this beautiful Dublin landmark will forever be the Halfpenny Bridge. As our time exploring Dublin is drawing to a close, we'll finish almost where we began, with the Vikings. The area along the River Liffey, known as Wood Quay, just a short distance from the bright and vibrant Temple Bar, is believed to be where a Viking settlement was established as early as AD 841. Ironically, the Vikings are rarely associated with Dublin today, because over the centuries so much history has taken place on these remarkable streets, and the cultural heritage of the city has constantly evolved and changed. However, the Vikings certainly knew how to pick a great site for a settlement, and it's well worth taking the time to find out more about their influence on Dublin's early beginnings. And so, our exploration of Dublin really has come to an end. There are so many places to see in this conveniently compact city. In fact, more than time has allowed us to feature on this particular occasion. Nevertheless, there's one thing you can be absolutely certain of. One visit to Dublin will never be enough. From the wonderful pubs where you can enjoy a perfectly poured pint of Guinness, or a drop of the Irish whiskey that Dublin is so rightly famous for, to the classical elegance of the city's golden age, and the cultivated green spaces where peace is guaranteed, every visit to Dublin will reveal previously unseen treasures, and hopefully, having experienced just a taster of what this great city has to offer, rather than being the end of the programme, this will simply be the beginning of a whole new adventure.
three old gypsies came to our hall door. They came brave and boldly, oh, and the one sang high, then the other sang low, and the lady sang the ragga-tagga gypsy, oh. Well, she slipped up a dress of finest silk and put on a hose of leather, oh. The ragga-tagga tags around the door, then she's up with the ragga-tagga gypsy, oh.